Okay, hi everybody. So in this video I thought it might be useful to just talk through this first reading, which is Weick's The Social Psychology of Organising, the first chapter. So let's get stuck in and we'll just go through page by page and think about what Weick's doing. So Weick's trying to make a number of points in this introduction. He's setting out his approach for the rest of the book, and in the rest of the book, Weick, although it's sold as a textbook, Weick's really making an argument for a particular style of thinking about organisations, and particularly thinking about organising. So his starting point is to go through a series of little anecdotes, and this is something Weick often does. He's sometimes described as an armchair theorist who looks at stories about organisations and how people organise and then tries to theorise on the back of it. And Weick's starting point, as he puts it here, is that the book is about organisational appreciation. What he means is, if we want to appreciate or value organising, the process of organising, we need to start to see what ties together lots of different stories that people tell about organising, and not just seek to reduce them to kind of linear, simple characteristics which we saw in the traditional model of organising. So he starts off with these sort of vignettes of things that are happening and gets straight to his main argument in this chapter, which is that all of these episodes, as he calls them, illustrate organising. Not organisations, but the process of organising. And he says organising is consensually validated grammar for reducing equivocality by means of sensible interlocked behaviours. Oops, there it is. To organise is to assemble ongoing, interdependent actions into sensible sequences that generate outcomes. So what he's trying to argue for is an understanding of organisations that's not linear, that goes from one thing to the next, but that's a circle or a cycle, where there is some sense of equivocal information or uncertainty that people experience, and they try to find ways of talking and doing things together that reduce that uncertainty. And then those things that are reduced, so this grammar, this consensually validated grammar, so agreed upon ways of talking about and understanding the world to reduce uncertainty, equivocality, that then create certain courses of action, which then feed back into the organisation. So let's keep going. So he said, organising is first of all grounded in agreements concerning what is real and illusory. And this is what he means by consensual validation. Ways of talking about the world. He said, this is what organising involves. A group of people getting together to agree what's real and what's false. The important point for Weick is that this isn't a question of truth. It doesn't matter if things people in an organisation agree that are real are actually real. His point is that within the organisation, everybody agrees that they are. And we see this all the time in organisational life. Organisations overvalue key performance indicators and take them as the only thing that matters, for example. And this is one of the things that Weick says is typical of organisations. Why? Because organising is about a group of people saying, this is real, this matters, this counts, and other stuff doesn't. And to do that, they find ways of talking about things and understanding the world. So there's a grammar. Okay, so that's the sort of first point that he's getting at. So he then moves on to tell us a little bit about what he means by equivocality or equivocal information. He said, organising is directed initially at any input that is not self-evident. Anything that's uncertain, ambiguous, the world that could be, described in loads of different ways by different people. The process of organising is about trying to reduce that uncertainty so that the inputs of an organisation become self-evident. Okay. He then moves on to say, well, why does no one else see this interaction, this looping, as he calls it? He says, well, one of the reasons is, in order to create sensible realities, organisations have to spend a good deal of their time reconstructing what they're doing, either providing after-the-fact histories which explain where they are now and make sense of where they got to it as if it was a sensible programme of action to achieve an objective, whereas in reality what he says is it's just people trying to figure stuff out. And he said it's also because organisations, because they're dealing with not the real reals, they're constantly having to produce facts and numbers and objective information that provide members of the organisation with reassurance that what they're doing isn't made up and that they're actually doing something that's very sensible and that the reality that they've constructed is real. So he goes on to say that the basic raw material with which organisations operate is informational inputs that are ambiguous, uncertain and equivocal. Okay. So just think about like the example he gives here, customers. What does a customer want? It's very, very difficult. Even who a customer is very difficult if you really think it through. You know, let's say you just go to the shop and buy a bottle of Coke. It might be for your family, it might be to mix with a cocktail, it might be to clean your toilet with. It might be because you want the brand Coke, it might be because you want the flavour of Coke, it might be because you've got a caffeine addiction, it could be because of all manner of things. So organisations have to find ways to reduce that uncertainty so that they can make decisions about, say, how to do marketing. This uncertainty causes people in organisations to enter into these cycles where they say, okay, well look, the only thing that's real for us is the brand. And then once you've got that, you start to act on the basis of that reality and you then organise the world around you. So his key point is that the really important thing, which differs from this traditional view of organising, is that organising is a process rather than a thing, and it's a process that's designed to reduce equivocality by providing common realities. Okay? And when we think in these terms, he then moves on to argue we have to start thinking about circles and theorising things in terms of circles and feedback loops rather than simple cause-effect relationships. So he gives this example of heavy machinery that's packed onto the soil and necessitates heavier machinery to break it up. So a problem is solved by the same problem. And so this kind of circular thinking, this dense circular thinking, is what happens in organisations. They describe a reality. You know, consumers want Coke because they like the brand. They do some stuff that then reinforces the reality that they've constructed and causes them to be highly structured by the reality that actually they constructed themselves. Okay. So this is his basic argument for his alternative view of organising. It's that it's a process and that it's a cyclical process that's actually very complicated and difficult to describe. So then he just starts talking through some examples, relating it back to the episodes that he talked about. And then he moves on to some kind of concrete illustrations, which would be classic from traditional organisation theory, something like a plan. When we talked about traditional organisation theory about the importance of setting out roles and ordering and coordinating behaviours. Plans are a key part of organisations, but Weick says plans are a key part of organisations because of the common reason people think, and the common reason would be because they help to coordinate what people are doing. You know, they set an objective and say, we need this, this and this to achieve the objective. And Weick says, well, actually, no, plans don't really do that. Plans try to say, here's where we might want to get to, but the future's very uncertain. He said, plans are often games that are played within organisations. Plans can be excuses for people to get together and create a reality of the future that they can work towards. So plans are not this very sensible linear process where we say we've got a plan and then we're going to move on to do these other things. Plans are really a cyclical element, And he just keeps working through examples of this cyclical, dense kinds of relationships in organisations to get to the series of points that he's going to elaborate on, and some of which we're going to cover in a later lecture or later class when we look at sense-making, this concept of sense-making. But for our purposes, what we can take away from the Weick as a representative of this non-traditional alternative view of organising is there's nothing to do with an objective. Rather, for Weick, organising is a process which allows groups of people to come together and do some stuff by reducing uncertainty. So there is some ordering, but that ordering is not straightforward and sensible. It's cyclical. And for Weick, the really key point for organisations is not what they can do, like the objectives that they can achieve, but the ways that they can construct realities for people. They construct facts. They construct value systems, what counts as being real, what counts as being important. And this is the focus of the alternative theory. How is it that organisations create value systems, not role systems? How do they create realities and facts out of ambiguous, messy, uncertain, unmanageable realities? So he then moves on to give an example of how he's going to do some of his theorising. So he offers an analysis of this poem, and what he wants to argue is that because organisations are dense and messy and complicated, the traditional view, which tries to simplify them down to some core principles, actually obscures more than it illustrates. He said what we need, because we accept that organisations are cyclical, circular and messy and dense, which construct realities, then we need to have ways of talking and understanding organisations which are also dense, cyclical and difficult to grasp, because that's what organisations are like. A social theorist called Theodor Adorno once said something to the effect of, we're thinking about complicated ideas, we need complicated ideas. We're thinking about the complexity, the ideas we have can't be simple. And that's kind of what Weick's getting at here. So he offers a poem and says this poem perhaps tells us more about how an organisation actually operates and the reality of life in an organisation than traditional organisation theory. And he tries to be a bit clever by writing it as this organisational chart. And the point of the organisation is that, or the point of the poem is to show how something which can seem democratic, an organisation which can seem quite democratic, can actually end up being controlled by just one person. The minority can end up having a lot of power over the majority, even though the majority are the people that are going to do stuff in an organisation. So he's not so much trying to make a point here as he is trying to just illustrate how he wants to theorise on the basis of different ways of knowing organisations, not just going and doing econometric empirical studies or interviewing people or doing ethnography as an organisation, but using something like a poem or philosophy to try to understand what it is. So he then talks about the idea of zones of indifference and the idea that authority comes from below, people's acceptance of authority isn't pushed down, but that ironically this can create a situation where, through this pattern of relationships in this poem, the power and acceptance of authority of the many leads to dominance by the few. So he said it's the pattern of relationships, not the facts that a great man sits on tops, that makes it possible for influence to be concentrated. So here he's focusing not on the organisation as an objective, but as a set of relationships that create a reality. And he applies this out to what was kind of common discussions at the time around flat organisations, ones where individuals are given more autonomy and there's less authority, to argue that actually even in those settings you still have authority structures in place. And he said, thinking about this poem, he calls it the rook. I don't really understand that term, but that's what he calls it. He said, you can see how this band of brothers operates as an organisation irrelevant of the fact that they have an objective. Right? The absence of a goal makes it more rather than less like an organisation. And here's the example of the circularity that he wants to play with. The traditional view says that you have an organisation, an objective that leads then to all these other things. Weick says no, the objective often emerges at the end. People already start to agree, socially organise and have roles and have interactions and patterns that lead them to do some stuff, and then they say, oh, that thing we did, that's what we meant to do at the start. Okay. He then works through some discussions of Herbert Simon's work, which we're going to cover later on the course, and the work of James March, all of whom were at the time trying to think about organisations systematically. That doesn't mean in terms of a simple, this means this, but rather trying to accept that there were complicated, adaptive, generative mechanisms at work in organisations, which you could in some way find a mechanism to describe. And Weick was arguing for this more reflective, cultural and artistic and poetic way to describe them. People like Simon and March go more to the notion of systems thinking and using kind of computer modelling. But we'll cover that for a later day. So that's the reading in sum on what he's trying to do. But the main thing I'd say is just try to take away from it not a clear understanding, because that's not the point. The point is to try to problematise clear understandings of organisations. That's what he's trying to get at. So hopefully that's helpful. If you've got any more questions, please leave me a question or comment below. Bye.